Good afternoon, and welcome to Many Paths, Many Visions, brought to you by the Labyrinth Society and with your host, Christiana Brenton. Today, my guest is David Gallagher, the current and only executive director of the Labyrinth Society, as well as one of its founding members. If you're joining us on this GoToMeeting session today, please mute your sound by clicking on the microphone icon in the upper left of the GoToMeeting control panel that will appear on your computer screen once you log in. If you call in by phone, you will not see this. You can unmute yourselves and ask questions during the Q&A session at the end of the interview. Find the GoToMeeting invitation posted on the Labyrinth Society Facebook page and global group and on the TLS website in the media section of the resources area. This episode is entitled How to Build a Labyrinth Organization 101. My guest, David Gallagher, helped to found the Labyrinth Society and has helped guide TLS over the last 20 years as its executive director, providing continuity as an invaluable foundational resource for subsequent TLS boards of directors, a huge factor in this organization's steady growth. Greetings, David. Welcome to Many Paths, Many Visions. Thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, Christiana, and thank you for your dedicated service in so many areas of TLS.
Well, you're welcome, and it's a gift and a pleasure for sure.
I feel the same way about my role.
Yes. I don't think you would have been doing it for 20 years if that wasn't the case. So it's very much in evidence for the longevity that you have shown TLS. So speaking of longevity, let's start with your interests in labyrinths. I'm sure lots of people know this, but for those of people who don't, when did that happen? When did you hear about them? When did they start coming into your life? And how did it lead you to the first conferences and meetings?
So longevity taken as chronology, summer solstice, 1995 was the foundational point in time when I attended a professional development conference where Joe Miguez, I didn't know him at the time, but it turned out to be Joe Miguez, who was also a founder of TLS, had created a labyrinth on this university campus in a quadrangle area. If you just mentally think of a grassy quad on a campus. And that was the first time I ever encountered a labyrinth. And it all just took off from there.
So speak to a little teeny bit about what that initial experience was like for you. Why was it so impactful? What type of labyrinth was it?
It was a medieval sharp pattern constructed using, and Joe, bless his soul, who passed several years ago, he would chuckle at this, that he used bolts and washers driven into the ground that set up the pattern, and otherwise it was just freshly mown grass. And I was there for pre-conference workshops, and during, I guess it must have been over lunchtime, an hour for lunch, but lunch for me takes 5 minutes. And so I was just out walking the perimeter of the quad, smoking my after lunch cigarette with a cup of coffee in hand, and glanced across the vista that was presented, and there was this guy out there fiddling around with all sorts of, you could see measuring tapes and the like, and containers full of the materials that he was using. And the perspective was it wasn't that low. It was high enough a perspective that I could see that he was working on the creation of a pattern in the middle of this grassy area. And so I just stopped my ambulation and kind of stared over there and watched what he was doing. And after 5 minutes or so, why he stopped what he was doing, left all of his gear there on the outer perimeter of this thing that he was doing, creating, and walked off. And so my curiosity was sufficiently aroused that I just kind of wandered over to it and walked around the perimeter. And it was pretty evident that there was, in the outer circle, there was an opening. And if you stood right there at that opening and looked in, it evidently, clearly was a path. And so I just, continuing to be prompted by curiosity, walked in. And that turned out to be the first time I walked a labyrinth.
Hmm. And so, do you consider yourself a left brain or right brain person primarily? I mean, was this appealing to your curiosity and your sense of order and geometry, or was this purely just a feeling that you had that you needed to go into this?
Yeah, I wouldn't try to isolate it into some sort of brain hemisphere function. We could talk about that, I guess. I've just always been a curious person, and that curiosity has often gotten me into trouble because I'd be off paying attention to something that I was drawn to via that curiosity when I was supposed to be paying attention elsewhere. And so it's just my nature. I've always been a curious person, and so the feeling, just the feeling. That's all.
Hmm.
Not
Okay.
that that's not anything. I mean, that feeling is pretty big when you really start to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and you were used at that point to listening to honoring that by and letting your curiosity take you various places. Whatever the consequences, you allowed yourself to do that.
Well, that brings to mind the famous Joseph Campbell quote, "Follow your bliss."
Hmm.
And in that particular moment, my bliss was this object that had attracted my attention.
Hmm. And so, okay, so that was the first. Then how did you get drawn into the group that was then later to develop into an organized group and an organization?
Well, this initial encounter, which I would characterize as having been I use the word superficial. It was a more of a surface experience than a deep experience. So that initial walking of the labyrinth, there were myriad of metaphors that immediately occurred to me as I continued with the walk and was observing how this path just was taking me more deeply in toward the center of the labyrinth, and the changes of direction were taking me away from the center and then back toward the center, and it had a kind of oscillation feeling to it. And that was all intellectually very interesting, but I wouldn't call it at all anything of a transformative experience. It was merely, I'd say, left brain.
Hmm.
And then subsequently, during this conference, I did have an amazing psychic experience. And that psychic experience, we don't have enough time to try to relate all of the content of it. But after that experience, my next encounter with that labyrinth there, because I kind of liked it. It was a really cool thing. And so I kind of developed a pattern that after each meal, for me, after each meal, the next thing is go outside and have a cigarette. So after breakfast, the following morning, that's what I did. I had my cup of coffee and my cigarette, and I went out and I walked that labyrinth. And then I went back to it again after lunch and dinner and so forth. Well, over the course of the week, this experience occurred in the middle of the night. And the morning after that experience, I just followed that pattern that I had been pursuing of after breakfast out and walk the labyrinth. And that then made a connection in my experience between what I felt the night before and what I'm characterizing as a psychic experience and the labyrinth itself, such that I couldn't distinguish between the experience and the labyrinth.
And so this psychic experience you had, was that a waking dream or a lucid dream during the night, or were you actually outside walking around? So this was, and then you walked again in the morning, the labyrinth in the morning.
Well, an objective observer, had there been such a fly on the wall watching what was going on, would characterize my apparent mental state as being fully awake. But internally within myself, I wouldn't fully agree with that characterization. So the idea of waking dream, which wouldn't be at all evident to an external observer, would to me be an apt characterization. What I actually experienced was the deep, deep feelings, high emotional intensity feelings of another human being who I had met during the week of the core course that I was taking. And that other human being was one of the facilitators of that course, with whom I had been somewhat at loggerheads over the course of the week. And I woke up at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning with this immense feeling of as if I were actually in her psyche experiencing what she was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And such to the extent that it caused me to be fearful of her well-being, and then prompted me to get dressed and go out on campus because I had this concern that she was out there. I couldn't locate her in space, that is in conventional space-time, but I had this concern that she's out there somewhere in immediate distress, and I felt compelled to go and offer whatever assistance I might be able to provide in the circumstance. So I wandered around outside, and I couldn't find her anywhere, and so I just went back to bed. And when I went back to bed, and I fell right back asleep again. I mean, it's not like I was so distracted and energized that I couldn't go back to sleep. So that would lead me to suggest the possibility that I was asleep the whole time.
And so then when you walk the labyrinth in the morning.
Yeah, that's the next question, of course.
Yeah. How did you integrate what you experienced? How did the labyrinth help you integrate that experience?
I wouldn't say it helped me. More, I characterize it that it did it for me. And in saying that, then I'm kind of distinguishing between the labyrinth as an entity and me as an entity. And it took, I would say, years of reflection on the experience, which is ongoing to this very day, that it then became hard to distinguish between me and the labyrinth. It's more now like I am the labyrinth and the labyrinth is I. And so what happened, of course, after I was awake, I fully remembered what had occurred during the night before. And that was certainly occupying my very curious nature. You could characterize the reaction as, in the vernacular, so to speak, what the hell was that? I had, what happened? And it wasn't so much a matter of, to me, it was just, what was that? And so I was quite engaged mentally with that when I followed my pattern after breakfast of coffee, cigarette, and walk the labyrinth. And so I was pondering the experience while I was walking, drinking, and smoking. And when I got to the center of the labyrinth, of course, I had my clipboard and notebook thing sort of tucked under my arm. And when I got to the center of the labyrinth, I felt this impulse to write. And so the cigarette by that point had been extinguished, and the butt of the cigarette was back in the pack of cigarettes, so it wasn't presenting litter in the environment. And I hadn't quite finished my cup of coffee, so I just set that down on the ground and pulled out the pen and started to write. And there was this flow of verbiage that came to me, and I just continued to move the pen across the paper until it seemed to have stopped. I didn't bother. I wasn't reading it. It wasn't anything that made any sense to me. It was just this continuous stream of expression, sufficiently discrete in its components that I could recognize that it was words, and I was just writing the words. And then when it seemed to stop, I picked up my gear again and started to walk out of the labyrinth in the normal manner. And I got like 4 or 5 steps out or on the departure path when the impulse said, "Hey, I'm not finished with this business. Come on, kick it back in here." So I just dutifully complied, and then there was more of this stream that occurred that I captured on the paper, and then it seemed as though, okay, it's finished now, so let's try this again, pick everything up and start walking out. And I walked on out. Now, the feeling that came with this stream, let's call it consciousness, that was then symbolized graphically in the writing on the piece of paper, it had behind it or with it the sense that this was for that person for whom I had been concerned the night before. And so I didn't go dashing out looking for her. I just simply walked out of the labyrinth the way you normally would, but now with the feeling that I have a message for you. And gosh, why can't I remember her name right? Maggie. I'll just use her first name, Maggie. Mm-hmm. And so then over the course of the remaining course of the day, I was going to encounter her again that afternoon. And I actually bumped into her before it was time to get over to the conference room for that afternoon session and said to her, "Hey, are you okay? I had this amazing experience last night, and I just finished walking the labyrinth, and I have a message for you. And so do you have a moment I can show it to you?" And she said, "No, I can't do that right now." So anyway, we put it off. And at the next opportunity, why, I showed it to her. Hey, yikes. And she just bawled like a baby. Ooh. I mean, she totally, this message, she related to it completely and with a high level of emotion. So part of this background story is that it was at that point that she related to me what she was experiencing at the time that I woke up at around 3 a.m. that morning. Mm-hmm. And the pieces fit, because what I was experiencing was her emotional response to what she was experiencing in that very moment. Mm-hmm. So the labyrinth is intimately related to this entire experience. And boy, if it's not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. Mm.
So fast forward, we're sort of off track from what we had said we would discuss, but I got to ask. So fast forward 20 years, you've been with the Labyrinth Society, you've been to all the gatherings, or most of the, and so in your estimation, how many stories like this have you heard from everybody that has come into contact with you over these years?
Well, that's going to, of course, be a finite number, but I can't specify.
Yeah.
many, many times. And it leads me to the generalization that everybody who's into to labyrinths has their story.
Mhm.
And the stories vary with the individual, but at the core, they have all the same central component. And I never thought about how I might generalize regarding what that central component is, but it has something to do with what I would, for want of a better expression, call self-realization.
Well, thank you so much for that story. I think a lot of people, especially people who are just coming to labyrinths, think that their experiences are isolated or something's the matter with them. Like, what are they feeling? Why are they feeling this? Or what's going on with them? And yet, I would say from listening to your story and so many others, not, of course, not exactly the same, but similar in certain ways. And this whole idea of self-realization or self-awakening or that there is or connection or reconnection is a thread, is an Ariadne's thread that totally weaves itself through uh, the stories that you hear when you've been involved for such a long time, I'm sure. So I want to go. So let's talk about. Let's go back now. I want to talk more about this you involved with now. Okay, and so now you're totally engaged. This is you're going down this path, and so that is how you end up connecting with the other people who then become the founding members. Talk a little bit about this, the interactions with this core group, and how you came together, and when you decided, okay, let's all take it to the as a group take it to the next step.
All right. So after that experience at that conference, um, I felt really as though I had been called to do something. What exactly? But to do something that involved this thing that's called the labyrinth. And Joe Miguez, of course, over the course of that week, why I introduced myself to him, and we started to become, and began the acquaintance. And he had promotional leaflets regarding a labyrinth conference that was scheduled for Lindrith, New Mexico in September of that year, 1995. And I just was so much drawn to the idea, but unfortunately it remained nascent, of attending that conference. My circumstances, particularly my personal and family economic circumstances, simply precluded that possibility. So I was unable to attend that meeting, but it was sponsored by Jean, what's Jean's last
uh,
name?
let's
She published the Labyrinth letter,
Yeah.
and she was the sponsor. The Labyrinth letter was the sponsor of that first all Labyrinth conference at the camp in Lindrith, New Mexico.
Jean
And
Lutz, is that her name?
Lutz, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lutz,
Yeah.
Jean Lutz.
Yeah.
I consider her to be the mother of the Labyrinth Society, sort of, or maybe the grandmother, and we might consider Helen Curry to be the mother, but she's definitely in the genetic mix as Jean Lutz, again, metaphorically. So by subscribing to her newsletter, I then became aware of the second Labyrinth conference at that retreat center in the Hudson Valley. It's a famous granola bar study center. I just don't remember the name of it just offhand. And so that was within, a 4-hour drive of here. And that was the following year, September, that would be of 1996. And so I was able to manage. And so I attended that meeting. And that's where I met all of those folks. Not all, well, yeah, not all, but a lot of the people who ended up being founders of the Labyrinth Society. So uh, after that meeting in September of '96, Jean, for reasons I won't get into, folded her Labyrinth letter and withdrew from her involvement with Labyrinths, at least publicly. And the folks who had attended both 1995 and 1996, and with Jean withdrawing as the sponsor of what was hoped to have been an annual meeting, that left everybody feeling kind of at loose ends in terms of, well, how are we going to get together again? So that resulted in an initiative. Robert Foray, Helen Curry, Annette Reynolds, and Joe Migas, the four of them, put their heads together. And Robert Foray and Labyrinth Enterprises in St. Louis decided to sponsor a Labyrinth network meeting, they called it, not conference, just so everybody would have the opportunity to get together and maybe talk about doing something that could kind of eventuate this network having an annual get together. So that resulted in the first, what eventually turns out to have been a TLS pre-planning meeting of interested people. There were 24 who attended at a convent in St. Louis. And so that meeting eventuated in the creation of what was called the Tribal Council. And the charge of the Tribal Council was to return the following year to the same venue, same sponsorship, and report on findings that were focused on researching what would be involved in creating a Labyrinth organization, and how would you go about doing that, and is this something we both wanted to do and were able to do. So that was the task of the so-called Tribal Council over that year between September of '96 and, no, September of '97 and September of '98. So when we got back together again in September of '98, the Tribal Council issued its report. There was a lot of discussion around the question of options, how to proceed. Development plan was agreed upon. The name of the organization was settled. We created a mission statement. A bylaws committee was appointed, and the Tribal Council continued in existence, with now the goal of formally organizing this as an incorporated entity, with the further objective of securing not-for-profit status for that corporate entity with the Internal Revenue Service.
Okay, thank you. And so what was your contribution to all of this? So how would you describe your contribution specifically to all of this this process?
All right, so I think the best way to explain that is in relating the story of the process of the determination of the first board of directors. Of course, this first board of directors was created in the absence of any structural legal entity. It was all quite informal. There were no bylaws that we needed to worry about compliance. And so we just went about it. And so when it came to the appointment of the executive committee, the officers of this, I don't know, maybe you could call it a blastocyst. It came around, it quickly Helen Curry was quickly determined to be everyone's preference for president. And then, gosh, I'm getting old and my memory's failing me. I can't see her name. I can see her face, but I can't see her name. She, remaining unnamed in the moment, um, as vice president, and then the woman from the Denver, Colorado area, she was she was decided upon, and she accepted the role of treasurer. And then it came to secretary, and people were nominating me for secretary. But my image of a secretary's duty is taking meeting minutes, which is not my bag. I've done it. I hate it. I just despise having to do it. And I said, no, 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 I'm not, you're not going to suck me into that. But I would be willing to be a corresponding secretary if you would at the same time also appoint a recording secretary. So they bought into that idea. And I became the corresponding secretary, and Annette Reynolds, the recording secretary, which alleviated me of that burdensome task, which I didn't want to take on. And so in the role of coordinating a corresponding secretary, that kind of, I guess I evolved that job. And it turned out to actually be a kind of hub of a wheel function where I coordinated all the communication within the group. Now, this is in the days, we're talking here now, November, late 1998 into early 1999. And by then, I had been fully assimilated into the internet and email. But not everyone on this board of directors that had just been appointed, not everyone on that board of directors was internet active. So in order to act as a communication hub, why I had to work with a combination of email and phone calls. And it took several years to get to the point where we had everybody on email. And in fact, there was a little bit of a controversy at one point because it was suggested that maybe it should be a requirement of board membership that you be email capable. And, and there was quite a bit of argument over that. But in any event, why we all got to be eventually email active, and then I simply was the communication hub. And so it has evolved around that kind of communication nucleus ever since.
So I'm just going to read. I've got the Excel spreadsheet up here. So it was Judith Joyce, who was a resources vice president.
Judith Joyce, yep.
Pamela Ramadai, that's the treasurer.
That's it, Pamela.
Annette Reynolds, the secretary, the recording secretary. Robert Foray, gathering liaison. Corporate idea was Joe Miguez. Yep. Development was Kay Torres. Energy keepers was Toby Evans. Neil Harris for membership. Regional refs was J.W. Blassingame. Mm-hmm. Labyrinth directory was Lillian Leslie. And yep. Nominating was Taffy Lanzer.
Yes.
Kimberly Lowell was newspapers and publications. Marty Kane was research, and Sig Lundgren was the site and infrastructure.
Yep, it all fits. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so all right. So, what was it like working with these people? Did you all get along? Did you enjoy each other? Was it at all ever content? I mean, you must have, I know there must have been some who were more right brain, some were who more left brain, some came from very different backgrounds, dowsing area rather than educational, or corporate. What was that like interacting with everybody back then?
Oh,
in a nutshell.
Well, I guess for me, the nutshell would be to say all of the above.
Yeah.
At myriad points along the path, I really wanted to devote an entire board meeting to the Myers-Briggs type indicator, to have everyone complete the instrument. And I'm certified in Myers-Briggs, so I could easily have facilitated the process. A couple of quick observations. The people who came together to form the Labyrinth Society could be generalized into two groups. One group was the dowsers. And in the initial organization of the Labyrinth Society, the American Society of Dowsers model was not exactly, but very, very closely followed. And then the other group I would characterize, and don't read too much into this labeling, as I'll call it the Christian group. So you got the Dowsers and the Christians, but this is not two armed camps staring hostilely across a chasm at each other. Everybody got along really, really well. And that dichotomy was never anything of what we might say of conscious awareness at all. However, I'm trained as a historian. My PhD is in history. The acuity of my observational skills were such that I was kind of conditioned, so to speak, to see these patterns. And in any event, there were a couple of interesting points of contention. One of them was at the very first board meeting, and perhaps it was the most salient of that meeting, where a topic on the agenda was the adoption of a logo for TLS. And we had put out, again, bearing in mind, this is the infancy of the electronic age in terms of the internet. So our initial publications were print publications, and nobody spent time calling every member at that point to ask them if they would like to submit a proposal for a logo. So a variety of logo proposals were made. And at that meeting, which was held at Neil Harris's place, the first board meeting was held at Neil Harris's place in, if I forget the name of the
Barrington.
Barrington, yeah, in Barrington, Illinois, outside Chicago. And interestingly, this year's fall board meeting, the board will return to Neil's place. And in that very same space where the first TLS board meeting, that is a board meeting, let's see, was that board meeting at his place before? Yeah, that was before we were actually incorporated. So it was still the appointed board from November of the prior year. It was in the spring. One of the items on the agenda was the adoption of a logo. And so we really got into that. We had several proposals. Robert Ferre was unable to attend. He's a kind of key thing for a punchline. So when we got to the logo topic, Robert participated by a conference line on the telephone. And before Robert got involved, we had pretty much sorted through the proposals and had come up with a design that we all pretty much agreed with. And it was actually a petroglyph from a stone outcropping in Val Camonica, Italy, which wasn't exactly a labyrinth, but sort of presents the impression of a labyrinth, if you're familiar with those petroglyphs. Mm-hmm. In any event, we got Robert on the line and said, okay, Robert, here's the one that we've decided. And Robert's reaction was, what are you guys smoking? That's not a labyrinth. So Robert was adamantly opposed to that. Now, that's not to say that Robert was going to be a self-exalted advocate for his own design, but it was what we have today is the TLS Labyrinth logo is the core of that. The central idea of it was actually Robert's submission. And after a lot of wrangling over this Val Camonica image and whether or not it is or isn't a labyrinth, and Robert, he's very particular in terms of details. Never go visit a labyrinth with Robert. He walks around and he shows you where all the mistakes are. Anyway, I had an experience like that with Robert once. In any event, so then that rough concept drawing that Robert had submitted, Marilyn Larson, who is a skilled artist, she took that and refined it into the artwork that we currently enjoy as the TLS logo. So that was one that was contentious. Then I guess the most contentious in my experience was at Fayetteville, Arkansas. That would have been the 2000th annual gathering. Of course, we always have a board meeting prior to the annual gathering. And at that annual gathering, I wouldn't characterize it as the Dowser wing of the board, but you look at the morphology of who was in favor and who was against, it roughly kind of fits that pattern. Is that we had called our annual meeting at that point a conference. So there was the 1999 annual conference and the year 2000 annual conference. And what SIG wanted to do was eliminate the word conference and replace it with the word gathering. And the board split on that. And it took 5 votes to get to agreement. Each vote was evenly split. I forget how many members of the board there were at that time. It might have been 12 or 14. In any event, it was an even-steven split. So it was kind of like a Gordian knot that we couldn't resolve. And the people who tended to support SIG were the Dowsers, and the folks who were opposed to it were those folks who were, roughly speaking, not aligned with dowsing. And it was interesting because at that conference, one of our evening sessions involved putting Lauren Artrist and Sig Lonergan on the stage, each of them with a microphone in hand and engaging in conversation, because the dichotomizing, if you will, of these two, not necessarily opposed, but different points of view, were personalized in a way in Lauren on the one and Sig on the other. And so they had a wonderful conversation and entertained questions from the audience, and it was a spectacular evening. And in many ways, where people had seen the basis of disagreement, they demonstrated the underlying harmony in the 2 points of view. And so it was a very kind of reconciling evening for people who were into that sort of frame of mind. I could observe it objectively. I never saw that it was such a big distinction, but yet at the same time, the surface details of distinction were perfectly evident. In any event, why the matter of the discussion, debate, not argument, over the naming of the annual meeting was eventually resolved. And on the 5th round of voting, I changed my vote and decided to go with the gathering thing, because to me, it wasn't really all that fundamentally important. It was simply a name. And that's how that got resolved. But it was contentious during that, 30 to 45 minutes of that board meeting there in Fayetteville in 2000. And beyond that, yeah, we've had our contentiousnesses, so to speak, but nothing that stands out so much in my mind that I would say, oh God, I remember that one. Hopefully we won't do that again. No, it's been quite amicable. In fact, the board, the people who come on the board, people who have had no experience with the TLS board, they don't have the basis to understand that when you join this board, you're bonding into a group of people who become really close friends. And so it's a wonderful experience, and I would call our board a close working board. In fact, I had been trying to entice Bill Caro for many years to join the board and assume the role of treasurer, and I was rebuffed, not rebuffed. He simply graciously declined in each instance of approach. And one of the comments that he made on one of those occasions was, I don't want to have any more involvement with dysfunctional boards, as if he is betraying the fact that his experience with boards has not been good. And at that point, why, he had never attended a TLS board meeting and didn't understand how our board functions. But he eventually was willing to become a member of the finance committee. And then, working with the finance committee, he then became interested in attending board meetings. And so now, if you ask Bill Garrow whether he thinks TLS has a dysfunctional board, I'm quite confident that he would say, no, 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 no. The TLS board functions beautifully. It's no way dysfunctional. So in this respect, why, maybe, if you can take the labyrinth as a symbol of the cosmos, and the Greek word cosmos means harmony, then from that point of view, why, our board is the labyrinth and is the cosmos.
So, okay, thank you. That's very enlightening. I love hearing these stories from someone who's so directly and intimately involved with this whole process, with the formation and years following of TLS. But for you, in your position, you hold a unique. Speaking of holding positions on the board, you hold a unique position as executive director. That was not something initially that the board thought they needed. When did that happen? And was this just a sort of so the same way with Helen Curry? Oh, she has to be president, and David Gallagher is just the perfect person for executive director. How did that happen?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, of course, it evolved. That's just the natural way in which things manifest and develop, is through that process of evolution. So how would I explain this? So I'm in this official position of executive director, and I mean a corresponding secretary, and that means I'm a member of the board. Now, bear in mind, the executive director of the Labyrinth Society is not a member of the board of directors. So when it comes to board meetings and motions that require a vote, I do not vote. However, in the executive committee, I am ex officio a member of the executive committee, so I can vote there, and any other committee on which I serve, because I'm also a member. The role of corresponding secretary, I would have to say, developed. And it developed in a way that I was taking on more and more responsibilities beyond the strict definition of being a correspondent. I just got my fingers got into all sorts of things. And I'm not going to try to enumerate them, because I'd have to step back and think a bit about what all of that actually looked like in terms of the details at the time. But it was requiring more and more of my time. And my life was in a kind of transitional stage. See, back in the 1995 episode where I had my first encounter with the labyrinth, now I had been teaching at Cornell under 3-year contracts as an instructor for about 10 years. And half of my professional time was devoted to teaching at Cornell, and the other half of my time was devoted to my own company, which provided management consulting services to veterinary practices. And I was teaching practice management in the veterinary college. And a couple of years prior to that June 1995 experience, there was a change in administration at the veterinary college at Cornell, and they decided to abandon this practice management course that I had been teaching. So I was out of a job, and that functionally eliminated our health insurance, my retirement plan, and half of our gross income. So that period from the point of termination to June of 1995, I was relying solely upon my consulting work and had been trying to build that business up to the point where it replaced the income that was lost with my departure from Cornell. And so that was making demands on my time. And then increasingly, the Labyrinth Society was making demands on my time. And so it got to the point where it had to be either one or the other. And I put it to the board, either I resign from the board, become the executive director, and you start paying me, or I have to withdraw, one or the other. And the board decided that they would start to pay me. Now, the level at which they started to pay me, God, I gag when I think about it, and I really wonder how we survived. But I'm a firm believer in the adage that was coined by Robert Foray, quote, "The labyrinth takes care of herself." Mm-hmm. And somehow, don't ask me how it happened, we managed to get through that period. And so I think that the labyrinth was taking care of me in order to enable me to do this job and what it has evolved into. So I at a pittance salary in November of 2003, I resigned from the board and became the executive director.
Okay, and what are some of the biggest? Okay, so I have a lot of questions here, and we don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to stop at some point because we're getting close, but I still have more questions, and see if anyone who was on, and there are a few people on, anyone who wants to ask questions of you, David. But for right now, let me ask two more questions. Number one, you're the formation of this position. Did that coincide with the beginning of the pod structure in how the board was organized, or did the pods come later? And have you seen, and in relation to that, have you seen your duties change as the pod structure changed, as TLS grew and matured?
All right, so there's an intimate relationship between the pod structure and my functioning, but also involved in that is the functioning of each and every board member. So we don't have time to get into the complexities of that. The pods did not exist at the time that I became the executive director. Helen Curry was the president at that point. She was succeeded by Kimberly Sayward, and the pods is entirely Kimberly's idea. Kimberly discerned the fact that TLS, as it was evolving, was becoming increasingly complex in terms of the ways in which we as a board and a society were pursuing our goals and gradually implementing the vision that we articulated at one board meeting, and that we were organizationally configured. It's sort of as though the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. And the pods was an attempt to, as I would describe it, integrate the varieties of functions and goals and elements of vision that were being pursued, largely with great success. So Kimberly intuited the need for an organizational chart, but traditional organizational charts are horizontal and vertical. And Kimberly was adverse to that model. And you'd have to speak to her as to how the intuition occurred, whether it was simply a pure intuition that came to her from nothing, or whether she saw other models that prompted her thinking in the direction of what we now call the circular pods. But that was her idea, and she was the initial implementer. And it makes so much sense that each ensuing president, as if you will, not the executive director, but the CEO, has moved it along and helped it to evolve further to the point where it is now. So if you juxtapose the original pods next to the pods as we have it today, without any of the intervening or intermediate steps from point one to point where we are now, you would be, it's quite evident that we're a hell of a lot more of a complex organization today than we were back then. So I think the pods initially came in 2 3 year term, 6 years, 1999, 2005. I'd say around 2006, 2007. But I don't remember the precise date offhand. So does that answer those questions?
Yes, sort of. And so how has your position changed? What are some of the challenges that you face as executive director as per these changes and roles that you've had to take on because the organization itself is getting more and more complex, larger, older, more an adult, organization?
Well, I need to be really careful how I approach that question. Let's just say that certain things needed to be done. I recognized when they needed to be done and how they needed to be done. That is a consequence of the background that I brought to the Labyrinth Society from my previous life experience, which was highly varied. And I was just the right person for the job at the time. And there was no question about that. It was very clear to me. And moreover, doing some astrological analysis overwhelmingly confirmed that that indeed was and is the case. So let's just say that there were things that I recognized that needed to get taken care of that I felt were not being taken care of to the extent that they needed to be or in the manner that they needed to be. And so I wasn't trying to turn myself into some kind of a dictatorial controller, but I filled the spaces where the spaces needed to be filled. Let's just put it that way. And so that all evolved into where it is today.
Well, and so that was your taking the initiative, seeing the spaces that need to be filled. Was there any time when you were asked to do things that were outside of the box for you or outside of your comfort zone?
No, quite the contrary. I think it was more a matter of, in some respects, you could say that I designed the job to fit my perceptions of what I believed the job needed to be. And you could say that I invented the job. I was at a point in my life where I needed something to do that made my heart sing, which at the same time would provide the material wherewithal to keep our lives together as a family. And I invented that job.
And so do you think that the position as it is now will survive in its present state for another 20 years, or do you see changes, or what might those changes entail? I mean,
Well, so let's say, all right, so let's hypothesize that I'm retired now. And so what does it look like? Well, the budget is now developed to the point where a somewhat not embarrassing financial offer could be made to someone who would assume the role of the executive director. And so now it's a question of what is the skill set that that individual needs in order to effectively fulfill the responsibilities of that role, but at the same time recognizing that the ultimate leadership of this organization is the board of directors, not the executive director. And so the future of TOS in the absence of David Gallagher is a matter of hopefully a firm organizational foundation having been laid and the torch being passed to the next generation that's going to continue the mission. And so what's necessary in that area, one area, for example, that I think is critically important where I'm becoming increasingly deficient is in the area, the broad general area of technology development. You know, this is simply something that I have not kept up with, and I'm becoming increasingly obsolete with each passing day in terms of my technology skills. I think they're adequate for the moment, but I think they're insufficient for the long term.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock. I just want to invite anyone right now. I do have a couple, just a little quick questions, but I want to make sure that whoever's on now, we do have a few people who are on the GoToMeeting with us. If anyone wants to ask David a question, if you're just listening, that's fine. You don't have to unmute yourself. If you want to unmute your mic and ask David a question right now, now is the chance to do so. Please unmute your mic, state your name, where you're from, and ask David your question if you so choose to. If I don't get any response, I'll keep going.
Hello.
Yes.
This is Ruta from Lithuania.
Hi, Ruta. Hi. Great
hello,
to hear your voice.
So it's nice to hear you too. I would like to ask David how he would see TLS in 10 years, for example. What might be his what this organization might face challenges or opportunities. How he sees the future of the TLS.
Well, Ruta, you're aware of the international situation.
Yes, I do.
And you're also aware of what the political situation is in the United States of America.
Yes.
And so if the labyrinth is a symbol of harmony, the current circumstances in the world and in the United States in particular seem to me to be discordant with the symbolization of the labyrinth itself. And if there's anything from the standpoint of the present that I see moving forward in the future is the imperative need to bring the labyrinth more broadly into the world. We've made wonderful progress over the last 20 years in that regard, but it is simply like a drop in the midst of a vast ocean. And we need to reach the ocean rather than the drop. So to me, if I could envision an ideal world 10 years hence from the standpoint of the labyrinth, we would have thousands and thousands of more labyrinths on the earth worldwide in every little corner of latitude and longitude. So the labyrinth is something that just by its very nature needs to expand. And as a society, that I believe should be our model. And so we will hopefully be in 10 years significantly more expansive than we are today.
Great. Thank you.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Ruta, for coming on and joining us today. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So some a couple of more things. I mean, this has been wonderful, David. Thank you so much. Just talk a little bit about these. Ruta mentioned these. What might happen in 10 years, but what are and some of it's very obvious. But if you could encapsulate some of the key changes that you've seen in TLS and in TLS as a representative for the worldwide labyrinth community since 1999. What would those changes be? What would you say they are?
The most salient change, in my opinion, is transition from print and voice to electronic. This whole world that has opened up of portable personal devices and iPhones and iPads as a kind of expansion of consciousness in a way, and as a method for reaching more deeply across the broad range of the world's soul. That's at the heart of it. And the Labyrinth Society is, I believe, aware of the importance of that. You can see evidence in it, or evidence of it, in the things in the way of major initiatives that we've been pursuing, and the presence that we have on Facebook. We need to expand into other areas of social media. And as the general population becomes more adapted to and possessing the physical parts of the technology that are necessary, as that becomes more pervasive in the world, we need to run along with that. In my opinion, that's the key to the future of any social organization, is its capacity to communicate with humanity. And so, I mean, we've been consciously moving in that direction, but I'm not so sure that we have a full kind of cosmological grasp of the significance of that. It's analogous to Jung's collective unconscious, that the collective unconscious is evolving toward higher levels of consciousness, and that in order to participate in that in an optimal way, we need to be going with that flow. And this is where I feel deficient, because I simply have not kept up with that from a technical standpoint. And frankly, I don't have any interest in keeping up with it. So we need someone in this executive director role who is highly conversant with that, stays in touch with it, stays current with it, and thinks innovatively in terms of ways in which the Labyrinth Society can, so to speak, run along with that momentum. If that answers your question.
Yes, that's great. We never really talked about, and this is sort of related to the wonderful story you told of your first experience and that psychic experience. Your memories of some of the gatherings you've attended. Do you have any favorite memories? Because I'm sure, since this is the way you started your relationship with Labyrinth, that you either experienced additional heightened experiences or times on the Labyrinth, or were allowed to participate in other people's, or were told others from other people. So can you share a couple of memories from some of the gatherings you've attended that you remember that are special to you?
There's one in particular, and it stands out among all the rest. And that is, all right, so what would the second one be? Okay, so I have the second one in mind now. So I'll tell the first story first, which makes sense, of course. And anyway, this was in Fayetteville. And at that time conference. And back in those days, my general practice, and still is today, is that when the day is winding down and it's time to head to bed, and back in those days, Jane did not accompany me to gatherings. Jane's only been to maybe the last 5. So before that, I was there alone. And my typical practice then was to walk a labyrinth. There were plenty of them available, and then go to bed. So I wandered over to this little gymnasium where Alex Champion had done a temporary labyrinth on the gym floor, expecting at that hour, why, it would be quiet and there'd be nobody there. And my own personal preference for walking labyrinths is to just be by myself in a quiet setting and walk the labyrinth. Well, so I walked in and there were 5 women who were sort of frolicking around the labyrinth. And I thought, well, yeah, why don't I just sort of wallflower over here in the corner a little bit, and maybe they'll finish up what they're doing and they'll leave, and then I can have the place to myself and have my labyrinth walk. And so Debbie Kermeen, it was Debbie who comes over to me and says, come on, you can walk the labyrinth with us. No, I just want to, no, you all do your thing, and when you're finished, well, then I'll walk. No. And she was very insistent. So I acquiesced and kind of walked the labyrinth while all of this, I wouldn't quite call it frenetic, but it was quite active, was going on around me. And I got to the center and just stood in the center, and then these 5 women converged on the center, surrounding me. And then they said, we're going to have a ceremony of reconciliation. And the idea was of reconciling or integrating the masculine and the feminine. And it was an indescribable experience, but it was the most moving of any that I have ever had at any labyrinth gathering. And I'll just leave it at that. Now, what was the other one? I had the other one. Oh, the other one. Yeah, the other one that I thought was really cool. So that one's sort of a right brain thing. This one's a left brain. And that is at the very first Labyrinth conference in Denver in 1999, at the closing ceremony, just around noontime, which that time of day is what you would expect it to be. During that closing ceremony was new moon. And it was a bright, if you can just imagine, on the high plains of that expanse of sky that's different from anywhere on either of the coasts. It's just like the sky is so large that you can kind of feel that difference. And in the midst of that closing ceremony, singing under Sig Lonergan's leadership, dear friends, let me tell you how I feel, which is almost like a gathering theme song at this point. We don't necessarily sing it every year, but the first time it was sung was at that Denver gathering at the closing. That in the sky, so to speak, in the midheaven, were the sun and the moon together, as at precisely at the phase of new moon. And it wasn't something that I shared with anybody, but it was just a very moving feeling that came with that moment, with that both astronomical and astrological configuration in the sky. That was for me a very big moment. And it kind of confirmed, in fact, one morning at that conference, I woke up and the thought that occurred to me is, This organization is now launched. At that point, we had bylaws. We had just officially elected a board of directors under those bylaws. We were incorporated. We probably didn't have our IRS letter of 501c3 determination at that point, but we were definitely officially and formally incorporated. And the feeling I had was, well, your work is finished here. And in retrospect, I look back at that moment and what felt to me like a recognition of work completed. It looks very different now than it did in that particular moment. That my work wasn't finished yet, but it's coming to a conclusion, Christiane. I'll be 80 next year, and I'm very, very seriously considering retirement.
Well, all right. So okay. So I hear you, and I will address that in 1 second. I just wanted to respond to that wonderful story of you being surrounded, and the vision, the image of you standing in the center, and you personally too, knowing you as I do, and I certainly don't know you for 20 years, but it's been a number of years now, and you standing in the center with surrounded by these women. And if anybody could create a potent, powerful ritual ceremony about reconciliation, it's Debbie Kermeen. I mean, she was our energy keeper. She is a dancer, a drummer. She does ritual and ceremony in labyrinths. That's what she does. So it gave me chills. It just gave me chills. I was like, oh my God, that must have been absolutely amazing, extraordinary to have the women in the different places on the labyrinth, in the different, was this a short labyrinth that Alex had done in the floor?
Alex. Well, you don't know Alex, then.
Oh, no,
well,
sorry. A classical labyrinths, right?
Oh, no, not a classical. Come on, Christian.
Well, I know him for the mounds, the outside one that he's done that's very famous. You know, that one.
Well, he would never call it a classical.
I wouldn't call it Cretan.
That's exactly right. Yes.
The Cretan. Yeah. So that must have been very.
The Labyrinth Society has never taken a position officially on that nomenclature.
Yeah. Well, it must have been an extraordinary experience sitting, being in the midst of that and being in the center of that with them, and because you were representing the male gender throughout centuries. I mean, the labyrinth surpasses time. It's past, present, and future. So there they were surrounding you and asking for reconciliation, it must have been quite extraordinary. How long did this last? Do you remember?
I would guess beyond what I had anticipated would otherwise have been my bedtime. All elements. It sort of was like it. The metaphor that's occurring to me is the cosmos beginning as chaos and gradually evolving an orderliness to it, and that process is still underway as we speak and will continue, if you adopt my point of view, eternally. I'd say easily a half an hour.
Well, thank you for sharing those stories. That's absolutely terrific, wonderful, and these kinds of stories. It's what Jeff does with the Cardroia and with Labyrinth Pathways, but there's just so many stories out there, and it's people need to hear this. People, I think, are hungry to hear this. It's healing to hear these stories. So thank you for sharing that. And so getting back to what you just said, you're thinking about retiring, and this is so what. And when you look back over these 20 years, what has been an Ariadne's a personal Ariadne's thread for you, an underlying principle or mantra that you follow that's helped you successfully navigate these 20 years of TLS? That you what can you say that stands out?
A 3-word answer with no hesitation: the labyrinth herself.
Mm.
Now, if we have another couple of hours, I could elaborate on that.
That's short and sweet and to the point. And I think that says enough, because everyone can interpret it personally. And I think that that's a gift.
Well, let me give you one elaboration.
Okay.
From my point of view, I do not serve the Labyrinth Society. I serve the labyrinth herself. And I do that owing to circumstances through the Labyrinth Society. But my ultimate teacher is the cosmos itself, and that is symbolized in the labyrinth. So I serve the labyrinth. There's never been any question in my mind whatsoever in terms of what I am in service to.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So if people are listening in, and to the people who joined us today, and, coming to gathering is a chance to sit with people like David, and with other people, other founding members who've had many, many years of experiences of labyrinths. You can get into really juicy conversations there. And it's one of the gifts that the gathering is. It provides time and space to have these long chats. And yes, maybe it's not your bed outside of your bedtime hours or whatever. And it gives you space to have these experiences that otherwise you might not have access to. And this really expresses that. I think what you said today to David and what you shared with us today really expresses that. And I so encourage people to see the participation in each gathering, especially this year, as a gift to yourself, and for your future, for your peace of mind, for your well-being, and think about coming, because it's such an opportunity to have these people around you. Even if you just sit and listen, you can sit in on so many different conversations and be a part of trains of thought and principles and processes, and it's just juicy. I can't. It's just so juicy being there, and whatever in terms of the labyrinth guiding you, and what David just said, he is in service to the labyrinth, and that energy, that vibrational energy, that is what we were talking about, what we're heading towards as a part of this next age, this Aquarian age, is vibration. It's all about vibration. So this is what we're doing when you get this distillation and concentration of this in this 2.5 day event, and then extend it out to the pre and post. You are a part of this. It forwards your personal trajectory umpteen fold. And I'm not saying that as nearly as eruditely as David would, but I am as clear about this with my own experiences as David has just been. So thank you, David. We're out of time. It's been such a pleasure sharing this hour with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Every bit my pleasure.
And many continued blessings on your path. And we'll be seeing each other in a couple of months.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you so much. So you've been listening to the Labyrinth Society's Many Paths, Many Visions on GoToMeeting and broadcast by Spreaker with your host, Christiana Brinton. Be sure to check the Labyrinth Society website media area, the Facebook page and global group, and YouTube, Google Plus for a list of upcoming dates and guests. Also, if this podcast has piqued your interest in the Labyrinth Society and you'd like more information about membership, please go to www.labyrinthsociety.org/membership. So we're going to sign off. Ciao, namaste, aho matakawe oasin, and may you find what you need on your path through life.